Well, good afternoon, honourable members. Welcome to this Paul Moulton production. My name is Stuart Watson. I'll be your host for this afternoon. Under Standing Order 8.13, I'm required to organise at least one joint meeting between candidates and members at the earliest opportunity after the close of nominations. To ensure that all candidates are known to the House ahead of the election. Members of the Legislative Council have also been invited to observe these proceedings, as have the media. I'll start by giving each candidate 3 minutes to make an opening statement and will allow a similar 3 minutes for closing statements when it appears to me that an adequate opportunity has been given to ask questions. I would ask each candidate to keep their answers brief to allow as many questions as possible, but I will limit answers to 2 minutes to ensure this. Members are of course free to meet the candidates outside of the hustings, and candidates have taken the opportunity to write to members, which is perfectly acceptable. Once the candidates have given their opening statements, I'd appreciate it if honourable members could signify their wish to ask a question by raising their hands, and I will call them in the order that they catch my eye. The candidates for today's hustings were determined by the order in which the papers were submitted to the Secretary of the House, and they are from my far left, and I'm talking physically rather than politically, Mr Bill Simmons, Mr Paul Crane, Mrs Crowley Bentham, Ms Diane Kelsey, Mr Craig Brown, Ms Mary Beth Cole and Mr Connor Keane. So we turn to opening statements, and I will ask Mr Simmons if you would care to start the ball rolling, please.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Honourable members, it was a very difficult decision for me not to stand for the Keys election in September. My family had serious health challenges and I simply couldn't commit to a 5-year term. But I can fully commit to the 15-month term for this position on the Legislative Council. I can assure you that I will fully engage in this role, and I understand the differences between an MHK and an MLC, and I will respect the differences in that role. As a recent and active MHK, I think I can bring experience to this role. And I guess, as those of you who worked with me in the last 5 years will know, I fully engage in all aspects of Tynwald life. I'm happy to ask questions, searching questions. I'm happy to serve on committees. I've moved various amendments to legislation. I've taken various bills through the House of Keys. So what that means is I have an in-depth, detailed understanding of the parliamentary process. And I think that is helpful. In addition, in my previous role as a banker here and internationally, I have got a good understanding on the Manx economy. And I've supplemented that by 5 years on Treasury Board. Subsequently, I also served on the Economic Recovery Group. So what that gives me is a good understanding of the Manx economy. And I think we all know how critical the Manx economy is for our future welfare. So I hope to bring this experience to the role. And honourable members, I would suggest that this is a critical time for the administration. Many important decisions will be made in the next 2 or 3 months, which will determine in many ways how successful this administration is or not. And I can start on day one. I can hit the ground running and I can bring my experience to bear to assist with these decisions. So overall, I think my experience will be helpful. If I'm elected, I will make a significant contribution over the next 15 months. I will fully engage, and I believe that my diligent approach and drive will add considerable value to all aspects of this role, not just the technical aspects, not just the scrutiny, the legislation, but also bring a real focus on delivery. And ultimately, honourable members, that is what matters for the people that we serve. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr Craig.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Fast am I. Good afternoon, honourable members. I'm grateful today to be under consideration for an opportunity to serve the island on the Legislative Council. I'm especially grateful to those who proposed, seconded and supported my nominations, and to those who've met me along the way to reach this point. I've just a few minutes to introduce my candidacy, so I don't want simply to repeat what has been written in the nomination papers. I want to set out 3 broad themes, and then I want to look for opportunities to expand on these during the questioning. So my first theme is that I know the Isle of Man. I know it through experience. I remember it as a young child. I remember the austerity of the Isle of Man in the early 1960s following depopulation. I remember the boom in the 70s. It was the end of that I started doing research on Manx population at university. I remember the perhaps inevitable bust that occurred at the early 80s. I remember the collapse of the Savings and Investment Bank. I remember the struggle that our Treasury Minister had as he fought to try and build successive reserves because the government was down to just 3 weeks of expenditure, and that was all its reserves. These are not just emotional memories. I view past decades with an analytical approach. I also know the Isle of Man through my research. My understanding of the island population issues is recognised. I'm well informed on both socioeconomic change and climate change. I think the important thing is that I know where we are and I understand how we got here. And this experience is relevant and could be invaluable. Second theme, I understand evidence. I get called a statistician. On an election night, I was labelled Dr. Numbers on Manx Radio. But my passion is not for statistics and it's not for numbers. What I try to do in the Isle of Man Population Atlas and elsewhere is to use data from a variety of sources to provide evidence for what is going on. In the Tynwald debate on Tuesday on the Island Plan, speakers referred to the need for baseline measurements, KPIs, evidence-based government. I know from years of experience how easy it is for the data, especially socioeconomic and environmental data, to bypass government decision making, for the evidence to be overlooked. I could quote examples of that. I believe that I could make a distinctive contribution to improvements in data, better use of data and a higher quality of evidence. And the third theme, I do scrutiny. I've always been analytical in approach. In education, I've been trained to develop scrutiny to a high professional level in Ofsted inspections, close examination, scrutiny by another name. In education, scrutiny is not opposition. It provides challenge in order to secure improvement in the school. It's firmly evidence-based. I would bring this experience of scrutiny on policies, plans, actions, and detailed scrutiny of legislation.
Thank you. Thank you. Subtle, we'll use that. Mrs. Bentham.
Good afternoon, Mr. President, Mr. Speaker and honourable members. I'm Corelli Bentham and I'd like to explain a little bit about myself because I think you've read all our nomination papers, so it's really a little bit more about me. I moved to the island from Hong Kong 18 years ago with my husband and 3 children who were under 3.5 years of age. I have no roots. I was born in London, I was schooled in Bristol and grew up in Swansea and Cardiff. My husband, on the other hand, is a staunch and proud Mancunian. We needed neutral territory. My husband and I both worked on Hong Kong Airport. Fortunately, we were approached by a civil engineering contractor whom we worked with previously to see if we would consider relocating to the Isle of Man. We arrived in winter and despite the cold, instantly fell in love with the freedom and outdoor lifestyle. As you've heard many times before, we were embraced by the community and it felt like home. Our 3 children went to school in Kirkmichael, then went on to Ramsey Grammar. Our 2 boys have recently returned from university and I'm pleased to say they've come back, they've got employment and they're settled here. Our daughter is at college in Manchester at the moment and we hope that she will also return. We all class this beautiful little island as our home. My only regret, and it sounds cheesy but it's genuine, is that I wasn't born here. My whole career in construction and education has had a focus on quality assurance, upskilling and improving standards. My job choices have always been to make a difference. This is where my passion lies. I've worked for both sides of the construction fence, for the client, for the contractor, for the public and private sector, in the Isle of Man, UK, China and Hong Kong. Although my career is construction orientated, it doesn't make me a one-trick pony. The construction industry shares similar issues, traits to other industries, hospitality, catering, agriculture, horticulture and engineering, for example. When considering whether I was up to the task, I looked at the CVs of the current MLC's members. There is a broad range of skills and experience on the council at present, but I feel my technical knowledge in construction, the environment, my experience of managing a large educational department and my connection with industry from the boots on the street perspective would assist the current council. Thank you for your time today.
So next to Mrs. Kelson.
Well, thank you for giving me this chance to speak to you at these MLC hustings. Firstly, I'd like to offer you some insight into my most recent work within the Office of the Lieutenant Governor. I've gained a breadth of experience behind the scenes over the last 4.5 years, seeing a range of primary legislation as bills and the emergency regulations as statutory documents. As a sounding board for the Lieutenant Governor, I've had to read all the material that's been presented for his approval. I've had to understand it, and this has given me a depth of understanding of the key parts of the legislative process. I've had to speak to the drafters in the AG's chambers and experts in the Cabinet Office if there have been any queries. So I'd be happy and confident dealing with them in future when reviewing and scrutinising proposed new bills or amending legislation, or, if required in the future, to comment on regulations. I also believe my ability to red team or critical friend critique some of the detailed and complex papers could be put to very good use in the future. My reason for asking for the MHKs to vote for me on Tuesday is that I now want to have a direct influence and personal responsibility to ensure that future Manx law is the best we can possibly get, and it's understandable by everyone who is affected by it. I've worked tirelessly in collaboration with you all to achieve this and would be productive from the very first day. I'm also prepared to roll up my sleeves and play a full role in the wider business of Tynwald and support others across the island in promoting the Isle of Man and the many good causes and businesses we are so lucky to have here. In this regard, my specific areas of interest are planning, especially the recent discussions about the Fit for Purpose All-Island Strategic Plan, infrastructure, transport, all aspects of education, the future of the visitor and leisure economy, and, as you might expect from my background, military and veterans affairs. And on this last aspect, I cannot close without making a comment about my unique selling point. After 23 years of service in the Royal Air Force, having been given leadership and decision-making responsibility as soon as I came out of officer training at the age of 24, I believe I can bring this experience to any roles that I'm given as part of Tynwald, as a member of Tynwald. I've got a strong sense of teamwork and duty and exceptional moral courage, and this has been developed over many years, and I would put it at the forefront of everything I've done and everything I do in the future. I'm definitely not a half measures person. I look forward to answering your questions as clearly as I can, and I look forward to convincing you to vote for me on Tuesday. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So that's Mr. Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, honourable members. I can't tell you how relieved I am to find that this is the Legco hustings and not an inadvertent audition for Blind Date. So, with that established, why am I here? Well, since moving to the island in 2008 with my wife, Natasha, I've worked solely in the finance sector. And that has been an incredible experience. It's given me an opportunity to get to know the island, to work in partnership with government, to represent the island on the Finance Agency Board. And in fact, even having stepped down as the ACSP representative on the Finance Agency, I still continue to work with them at the moment on the skills shortage, and that's something that I would very much want to continue to do if elected to council. I've also had the privilege of working with the Manx community in the third sector. Currently, that involves supporting my wife in the running of and teaching of swing dancing through Swing in the Isle, which is used to support the physical and mental well-being of our island population. And equally importantly, it gives an opportunity to work with other worthy causes such as the Armed Forces Day and other charitable ventures. Now, what these experiences have taught me are the many and varied, incredible skills that the Manx population has to offer. And I believe that we have a fantastic opportunity at the moment to further improve our status as a jurisdiction and make this an even better place to live. And unfortunately, being in business, however much extracurricular activity you put in, does prevent only limited opportunities to do this. And so after more than 30 years in business, my aspirations have moved now much more towards the forum that allows a direct influence, namely LegCo. So what does this mean for the role of LegCo and what I would bring to that? Well, the press described me as a finance professional. That's accurate, but it's not the whole truth. Yes, I have multinational business experience. I have extensive business leadership skills. And my professional qualifications and experience give me the ability to read, interpret and apply legislation. My engineering background gives me the foundation to challenge and question, always trying to improve things. And I think that the successes of my career speak for themselves. But it's not the financial successes that I'm talking about there. They're simply measures, they're not the successes themselves. For me, the things that resonate most are those that talk closely to my personal values, namely putting people and stewardship at the heart of everything that I do. For me, the greatest sense of achievement has come from working towards working environments that are safe, enabling, encouraging, because those are the environments in which people thrive. Success, however fleeting, can be... Thanks, Stuart.
Sorry. Ms. Colley.
Mr. President, Mr. Speaker, honourable members, I'm Mary Beth Cole, and I'm honoured, thrilled, and humbled to be sitting here alongside some formidable candidates. For those of you I've not had the pleasure to meet, I'm one of the vintners, of foraging vintners, the Isle of Man's only winery. I'm also a board member of the Visit Agency and active in our local trade association of Visit Port Erin. Oh wait, I also have a day job where I work full-time in the legal and contracts team of an international yacht management company that has operations and offices over 15 jurisdictions worldwide. As you can tell, I like to be active and engaged. As you can probably hear, I'm not native to the Isle of Man, but I got here as soon as I could. My story of coming to the island is not entirely unusual. We came with the intention to be here for a year or two, fell in love with the island, and have not looked back for over 10 years. The island is an incredibly accommodating, and we've received the full embrace of its Celtic heart. I was born and raised up and down the eastern seaboard of the United States between Florida and New Jersey. I went to high school in Freehold, New Jersey, the same as Bruce Springsteen. We had the same English teacher. I studied political science at the University of Houston in Texas, and then was working full-time in investment banking in the energy sector. I've always had an interest in how our government institutions impact decision-making, and that formed my interest to further study law at a postgraduate level. I obtained a Juris Doctor degree from the University of Queensland and was entered onto the role of solicitors. We later moved back to the US, and I was admitted to Colorado and New York as a legal practitioner. And my legal work was heavily involved in property, natural resources, and environmental law. All those areas are heavily regulated by state and federal authorities, so engaging with the government is just something I do. Relocating to the Isle of Man and opening a startup business quickly put me in touch with all the government departments here, and I was able to understand an understanding of how their processes work and where there were efficiencies and weaknesses. It's been an amazing journey for me so far, and I am proof that the Isle of Man is where you can. I feel the culmination of my background, education, and experience has led me to seek the role of becoming a member of Legislative Council. I'm motivated, energetic, and enthusiastic, and I'm ready to work. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Keane.
Good afternoon, Simmons members and guests. Mr. Speaker, thank you for inviting me to this forum and allowing me the opportunity to present myself, express my ideas, and answer members' questions. Thank you to those members who have given their time prior to today to meet with me, both face-to-face and over the phone, as well as via video call. I'm happy to make myself available after the hosting, should members wish to discuss anything further. To briefly reintroduce myself, I'm a teacher, a school governor, and president of the National Education Union. I was educated on Ireland, leaving to study at university. My interest in politics began around the time of the discussions about the VAT sharing agreement and the reciprocal health agreement. My political interest has developed through my career and life experiences, and I've continued to follow local politics with a keen eye since. Whilst my day job doesn't allow me time to visit the public galleries, I try to keep abreast of developments through the local media, as well as the excellent Tynwald website, listening to debates, reading order papers, as well as Hansard extracts. Tynwald is a microcosm of our society. We have just elected the most diverse House of Keys ever seen. The most diverse Council of Ministers has just been formed, and I feel I could represent that diversity on LegCo, which, whilst acknowledging not all recommendations were accepted, was a suggestion in the Lisfane report. I represent an alternative option with requisite skill sets that is representative of our island and its population. The 2016 census suggests there are in the region of 25,000 people between the ages of 16 and 40 on Ireland. I think it's fair to suggest that generally these are the lesser politically engaged age bands. I can provide LegCo with the views on these demographic groups while offering a younger perspective to the political debate. I believe an increased breadth of community representation can only be beneficial to Tynwald as a whole. I seek your support today and hope to show you that I'm a credible candidate for a position in LegCo. I do not sit here today as a prospective MHK. I am understanding of the distinct roles of Keys driving policy with scrutiny provided by Council. Whilst mindful I may need to provide some political input in Tynwald and voting situations, I am acutely aware of the sensitivities that come with regard to LegCo and its indirectly elected position. It is my belief that a successful and vibrant Tynwald is about personalities and relationships, as well as skills and experience. Fostering a strong, positive and cohesive group dynamic is, in my opinion, vital to Tynwald discussion. I believe I represent these values, and to highlight my commitment to these ideals, in my due diligence for the role, I've tried to reach out to MHKs, MLCs, President of Tynwald and other Tynwald staff. For me, there are no qualifications that fully prepare you for politics. However, I believe I have the skills, work ethic and personality to evolve in the role of MLC and make positive contribution to parliamentary processes. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you very much. Now, honourable members, over to you. Questions? Who'd like to kick us off? Well, that concludes the hustings. Mr. Hooper.
We'll get the ball rolling, Mr. Speaker. So, a lot of you talked there about quite vague terms like scrutiny and, when not being in that policy formulation role. So, actually, can you expand on what you all meant by those kind of phrases? And quite specifically, would you, if you were elected as an MLC, would you take an executive decision-making or policy responsibility within government?
Okay, so what do you mean by scrutiny and would you take on a government role? First to answer that, I'll ask Mr. Crane, please.
Thank you for the question. Yes, scrutiny in the context of Tynwald is a very, very broad context because you're not just talking about scrutiny of legislation, you're talking about scrutiny of policy, you're talking about scrutiny in terms of questioning in Legislative Council or in Tynwald, so there's a range of areas to it. At the heart of it, I would go back to my experience as an Ofsted inspector. I did training in the UK and then took part in some big Ofsted inspections in the UK, then came back and used the skills really within the Isle of Man education system. But scrutiny in education is very, very broad because when you're part of a team, you may have a subject that you're scrutinising specifically, and that means you're looking at students' work, you're talking to students with interview focus groups, you're going into lessons. You're doing all of that with a blank sheet of paper. You've got some ideas before you've gone into the school because of the data that you've seen, but you're doing that from a blank sheet and building up a picture. And when you give feedback on it, it's an absolute requirement because you're likely to get challenged in that sort of context. It's a requirement that you're able to provide two pieces of evidence on the tip of your tongue to anything that you're saying as a judgment relating to it. Now that sounds quite harsh when you use the word judgments and schools talk about inspections, but these are just close examinations, which is exactly what scrutiny is. And they're undertaken not in any sort of opposition to the school. That would be disastrous. So you're not going into a school to oppose, you're going in to try and improve what's there, to try and build on it, and show what the strengths are and look at areas that could be developed. So that's the broad approach to scrutiny. But within a school context, you can be asked then to go and undertake a scrutiny report on an assembly or any one of a variety of different activities happening in the school. So it's much like that. in terms of the skills required and attention to detail, a focus on and what things resonate with each other. So if the data's saying this and what you're seeing in the lessons matches with that, I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you. Mrs. Bentham.
So what does scrutiny look like in practice? Looking at legislation and reviewing it so it reflects the meaning behind it, or what your meaning is that you want to be behind it. It's important to look and identify where decisions could be improved and how to prevent mistakes from being made or repeated. So I think the focus really is on moving things forward thinking and making positive changes. In terms of departmental work, I think the MLC role's main role is scrutineering, and that is the primary function. But I think my experience in construction, the environment, skills, could be used on specific projects within the department, and I'd be very willing to contribute if asked to do so.
Mrs. Dawson.
So what is scrutiny? I think it's hard work. It involves a lot of time, a lot of energy, and sometimes asking stupid questions, or potentially stupid questions, to make sure you fully understand what you're reading and what somebody else has written. I think sometimes you can be very close to the written word or the discussions, and sometimes miss the obvious, or maybe miss the subtle. So my view of scrutiny is the hard work that MLC should be doing is to take that hard work and get on and read the information, understand the problems, and make sure what comes out at the end of it is better for our input. As far as executive decision making, I find this one quite difficult because I sort of want to be involved in a bit of decision making, but actually really to make sure we can influence good Manx law in the future. So if I had a skill set that a department could use, or even just an MHK wanted to put a private members bill through, then I would be very comfortable and happy to support and help them in that process. I'd probably be quite firm as well if I felt that we were going a direction that I'd want to understand a bit better, but I would be supportive as opposed to looking for a decision-making role in a department or elsewhere. So project work where a skill set can be used, yes, but looking for membership of it in a department, probably not. Thank you.
Mr. Brown.
Well, I think the easiest way to answer this for me is to use something with which I'm familiar, which is boards of companies and non-executive directors. To me, scrutiny is what a non-executive director would exercise within a company. You, the House of Keys, as the elected representatives, are the executive board. It is absolutely right that the formulation of policy rests with you. And the Legislative Council is, from my take, the non-executive board. It's there to offer experience, the oversight, reviewing and understanding what the intention of that policy was, addressing areas that perhaps are not clear or are even going well, and providing feedback. Now, inevitably there will be areas where lines are blurred, because if you're providing scrutiny, if you're giving feedback, how can that not at times step over into affecting the formulation of policy, if not actually the executive side of that? So it should be separate, but I think that there are blurred lines. As regards a position in a department, well, that's really for the job description to tell us that. Whilst the job description requires and permits it, then of course if asked and if I had skills that could be used, I'd be happy to participate in any way possible until told otherwise.
Thank you. Ms. Cole.
Scrutiny is kind of a loaded word. I think a lot of our first experiences with the word scrutiny is kind of judgmental, maybe sometimes harsh. But the way that scrutiny needs to work here, it needs to have a whole different concept, which means improvement. So when you're engaging in scrutiny, it's to try to find how can you improve this? And how can you improve either technically to make sure that the legislation is working with the intent of the policy, and also a little bit more forward thinking. Can we structure this in a way that it's future-proofed? What is this bill going to look like? What's this law going to look like in the year 2040? Because sometimes that's the longevity of the laws that we have here. So I think a lot of the elements of scrutiny is sometimes done in some form of thinking that it might be confrontational, but it's really not, because everybody is just looking to move things forward. And that's why I see scrutiny more as a role of trying to help and trying to create improvement. As for the role of government role with executive decision making, I feel that the role for us, and the way it's been explained to me, and one of the members explained to me that I thought was a very useful example, is that sometimes the MLC can provide sort of a function within a government department that acts as a liaison or sort of a link between the two. So you have the civil servants who are acting under one set of interests, and then you have the MHKs who have another set of interests where they have to answer to a constituency. And the MLC sometimes is able to sort of balance the competing interests and provide a more well-rounded and more plausible solutions to help both sides get to the end goal. So from my point of view, if that type of role precipitated and you felt that it was necessary for me to engage in it with my expertise, it'd be something I definitely would consider. However, I do feel that most of my role,
Thank you.
Mr. Keane.
Thank you. For me, an important aspect of scrutiny is getting people with practical knowledge, practical experience of assessing whether the actual piece of legislation meets the policy it was intended to do. I'm thinking from a legal perspective. So whilst a piece of legislation might work from a legal perspective, on the ground, does it actually work in practice, and does it meet the policy intent that was behind it? I think another aspect of scrutiny that's important for me is to assess not just what is there, but what's not there. So looking for gaps and seeing if there's anything that can be added and improved in any way. I'm just thinking again from a scrutiny perspective. For me, the scrutiny is not just sitting in a chamber on a Tuesday. The scrutiny is out actively engaging with you guys, potentially actively engaging with departments and committees as and when, and kind of doing that scrutiny on the job, if you like. The second half of the question, I think the most important aspect is to get the best skills in Tynwald into the relevant positions. So for me personally, I'm not against MLCs having a position within a department, but I think it's crucial that the ultimate policy must remain obviously the driver of the MHK and the department itself. I noticed that MHKs have been used a bit more MLCs have been used more creatively in the past. I'm thinking perhaps of the Equalities Champion, where it's not necessarily a direct policy remit, but the skill set is still used within the overall remit of Tynwald. So I don't know whether there perhaps be any more scope to explore avenues like that, rather than the actual route of a policy.
Thank you very much. Mr. Simmons.
Yeah, thank you. Perhaps if I could answer the second part of the question first. So I would not sit in the department. My personal view is that MHK should lead on policy. However, I would be very keen to serve in one or a number of the boards that are being set up. I think they're a very good, innovative initiative. So, for example, the Economic Board, I think I can really add some value to that given my expertise. The Climate Change Board is a passion of mine. How do we get those ideals translated into practical things implemented on the ground to help people? So I would be pleased to work with Treasury to see stuff actually rolled out which gets things done. The Housing Board, for example, we have a housing crisis here, so I believe I could provide some expertise given my background in mortgages, and also some rigour and pace to these things. And I mean, generally, going back to the initial question about scrutiny, yes, of course, scrutinise legislation. I'm very comfortable doing that, and I've got a track record of doing that and raising points and amendments to refine legislation. But actually, one of the biggest issues we have is the effective implementation of policy, and that's where I think I can bring scrutiny, and I think bring that to bear for the benefit of everyone. And often we face similar problems to other places. So are we adopting best practices? How are they getting on with these challenges? Can we learn from them? So I'm very excited about the annual update by departments and boards to Tynwald as well. I think that provides a fantastic opportunity for scrutiny. So I think that's what I'm saying is this is not just about legislation, about policy, it's about how it's implemented, because that's what makes a real difference. And that's what I hope to bring in the next 15 months, is bring some real rigour to that implementation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll move to the next question. This is Keane.
Thank you. Just like to say thank you all for standing and giving us a really good field of candidates and a really hard decision to make next Tuesday. For me, obviously climate change has been much in the current affairs. with COP26, the imminent, hopefully, enactment of our climate change bill and our commitments under the Paris Agreement. So my question, where would you sit if Tynwald was asked to support licensing further exploration of a gas field in Manx waters at this time?
Where would you sit in terms of exploration of a gas field in Manx waters? First one on that question, Mrs. Bentham.
Mr. Ashford was just asked this on the man in line at lunchtime. So, from my point of view, climate change is so important. It is an emergency. I think we've missed a trick with Professor Curran's report. His remit was to look at how to achieve net zero by 2050. I think it should have been 2030. So I am passionate about the emergency. There's one side that says if we explore for gas, it could mean that we could take that money and pump it back into to look for different ways of renewables. We can't just turn that tap off in 10 years' time. We will need gas for the next 20 years, unfortunately. However, the environmental in me says no to that. So I would sit and say no.
Thank you. Mr. Kelsey.
I think I'd have to say no. But the reason I'd say no is not because necessarily there is loads or not loads of gas sitting in Manx waters and whether it would or wouldn't be a good thing to do. It's, if you think about the time and the investment that we'd be putting in to get that gas out of the ground anyway, regardless of climate issues, why don't we spend that money and that time and that intellect on actually developing green sources of energy on the island? You know, we have a lot of wind, we have a lot of tide. So that's where we should be investing our money, and that's the way the world is going. So why would we invest the time and money into getting gas out of Manx waters? I'm disappointed to say that, because if it wasn't for climate change, I think if you've got a resource, you should look to see whether you can exploit it. But 20 years ago, 30 years ago might have been the time. 2021 is not.
Thank you much. Mr. Brown.
Well, I think it's a great time at the moment that everybody is finally recognising the impact of climate change. There are very few naysayers anymore, and it's vital that we continue to work towards that. Gas fields are something that clearly have no future. Gas as a fuel is being phased down, sadly. If you believe what's been said at COP26, it should really be being phased out. And if this were an ideal world and if we had ample opportunity, of course we should explore gas in Manx waters, for exactly as Mr. Kelsey said there, to use that money to invest in other sustainable green energies. But the fact is, we don't want new gas boilers being installed. We don't want to continue to add to the greenhouse gas effect and climate change through the production of gas. And Mrs. Kelsey is quite right. The time taken to explore and then extract that gas simply is not viable. So I would not support further exploration. I would much rather work towards a holistic and sustainable energy policy, which, I know you didn't ask the question, but I think it has to involve nuclear and various other possibilities as well.
Thank you. Ms. Cole.
I don't think this is an either-or question. Energy security is going to be with us for the next 30, 40 years easy, until we are able to find our own sustainable way of creating energy for ourselves. We've just spent, I think, a lot of money putting infrastructure in for gas over the past 5-10 years to individuals' homes. Having worked in the offshore and lots of experience in offshore energy industry, you want, as a nation, to have control over it, because you can regulate, you can legislate, you can create controls on it. You control what the environmental conditions are. You control who the directors are. You can control a lot of the actions. And so from my point of view, I don't see this as an either-or proposition. I see this as we need to explore whether or not this is actually a viable option, but we need to just as aggressively explore all the other options we have available, tidal, wind, solar. Because at the moment, it is a climate crisis. We do need to do something, but it's going to take time for those other energy sources to really be able to satisfy our increasing need, especially if we start talking about everyone being on electric vehicles. How's the grid going to manage that? We don't even have the infrastructure ready for that now. So I think it's not a hard yes or a hard no. I think we just need to make sure we understand what all of our options are.
Thank you. Mr. Keane.
Thank you. I think with regard to climate change, I think sadly we have to recognise ultimately as the Isle of Man, our policy isn't going to make or break the global global strategy on climate change. But I don't think that should stop us from trying and reaching out to do the right thing. As regards to exploration, as was touched upon by previous candidates, it's an ageing process. So for me, I would ultimately be against that. I would prefer to explore other eco-friendly methods of business and try and attract inward investment that way. So rather than take the kind of the short-term option, perhaps look at the more long-term and think, look, if we can branch out and attract even more eco and green business to the island to supplement the existing workforce and develop things that way, that would be my way of approaching things.
Thank you. Mr. Simmons.
Yeah, thank you. I'm a definite no. But I'd just like to say I'm actually pretty sceptical about the gas reserves. My view is various people have looked at this over the last 30, 40 years. It's never been viable. So I think this to be honest, I question whether it's actually a real opportunity. But even if it was, I would still say no. And let me explain why. Because if we look at COP26, look what's the big emergencies happening in the world, that's a massive issue. But it's not just for us. And people will say, actually, what's the Isle of Man? We're tiny in comparison to China, to India. And I get that, and I get why people have that view. But more importantly, if we look at what we need in investment in our economy, the people that are going to invest in our economy will not buy into a gas field. If you look at Google, Microsoft, all the large knowledge-based companies, which realistically are the sort of people that we want to come to the Isle of Man, they want renewables. We've got a fantastic opportunity in renewables. 4 big turbines would power the whole island. Yes, we've got an issue when it's not windy, but there are options around that don't involve extracting from the gas field. So if we're serious about creating a future for our young people and growing an economy, it would be absolutely foolhardy to extract the gas. It would be mad. If we're serious about creating opportunities for the future, we should embrace renewables. We're behind others. We need to get our act together. We need to get going, because actually that'll create a lot of jobs, create a lot of opportunity for the island. Thank you.
Mr. Crane.
Thank you. I share my thoughts with Bill on this in many ways. I can understand, though, why the idea has come up that can't we just get this gas into use and somewhere in the international markets, quickly in the period we go through. And yes, I can see the temptation to do that. But the problem with it is, within the Isle of Man, we've already said in the Climate Act that by 2025, from the 1st of January, you won't be able to have any new houses with fossil fuel boilers. So they couldn't use this gas. We've got interim targets to fix for the end of April going forward with the climate bill. Will those targets put the date on when all houses have to come out of fossil fuel, and then they couldn't use this gas? We've got maybe something like 20% of the world's known fossil fuel assets already cannot be used to keep the global temperature below 2 degrees, let alone 1.5. So the stranded assets issue is growing and growing out there, and the risk that we would end up with this happening in the gas from the Irish Sea. So I don't think we'd afford to do it. I'd absolutely agree, inward investment will be hit by this. We already have some big companies in the Isle of Man that internationally have a commitment to be carbon zero by 2030. This is not in their interest. It definitely affects their possible location here and future expansion here. So there's a whole raft of reasons really why we shouldn't do this. Perhaps just finishing, Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, just last week, the earth is hanging by a thread, is his phrase. Back in August he said we're on code red. Which parts of that are we not understanding when we're still chasing gas assets and production of them? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next question has Mr. Wardenberg.
Thank you. So recently, Tim was asked to vote on a gas increase. For the increase or against the increase? And I'd like to ask each one of you just to give me one word answer, no explanation, if it's a for or against the increase, please.
Okay, how would you have voted on the gas price increase? First up, Mrs. Kelsey. For. Mr. Brown.
For.
This feels like I'm taking a division here. Mr. Cole.
For.
Mr. Keane.
For.
Mr. Simmons.
No, I'd have collapsed the company.
Crane?
Yeah, 4.
4.
And Mr. Bentham. Wonderful. Okay, Mr. Glover, you're next.
Thank you. We've got a very difficult decision and vote to make next week, and of course part of your 15 months will also involve pressing the green or the red button within the Tynwald chamber. So my question is, can you help us here with the 2 vacancies, as well as your good self getting elected? Who else out of the candidates here would you like to see elected?
Okay, who else would you like to see elected alongside you? First to answer that one, Mr. Brown.
Wow, what a first question to come to you. Given that I'm going to have to work with whoever this other person is if I'm elected, I have to think very carefully here. But we have to have disagreements as well, and as you say, tough decisions are there to be made. I can honestly say that the standard is fantastic here, and I would be happy to work with any of the other 6. However, you pressed me to say who would I work with. From what I've heard so far and from the engagement that I've had, I would very much enjoy working with Mrs. Cole.
Wow.
You're not supposed to realise that was the idea.
Ms. Clark, sorry.
Yes, that's a very tricky question. We had a really good meeting on Monday with the Positive Action Group, so we got a little bit of a taster of what each other's experience was, and it's been really exciting to sort of understand everybody's what they bring to the table. And just your speech this morning, actually, just today, was really interesting, how you mentioned the demographic and that you can get that engagement from the younger people, because the young people here, for me, the young adults here, they need a bigger voice. Their voice needs to be in the forum. So I really have pleasure for you to be elected.
Thank you. Is that music? Obviously, we've all tried to do our homework, I think, questions-wise, and that's one that definitely didn't register with me at all. As I must say, when I went home on Monday, the first thing I said to my partner was, wow, everybody is actually really good. I thought there might have been 1 or 2 that might have slipped through the net, but regrettably there hasn't been. I'm just thinking from a complementary perspective. So one of my reasons for standing is I think I could complement the existing skill sets and people which are on council, and I think I would take a similar approach to that. So I'd have to say Mr. Brown, with his kind of financial expertise, which is certainly outwith of mine, would perhaps get my vote.
Thank you. Mr. Simmons.
Yeah, thanks very much for that question. I guess I would like to think about that a bit more. And I guess I would suggest that as Tynwald members, we should not make snap decisions like that. We should weigh up all the pros and cons. So just as if I was in the chamber, I would look at the pros and cons, analyse the options, and I would then make my assessment. I would not just shoot from the hip and make my assessment now, because I think actually I look around this table, there are 6 very worthy candidates. So it's a tough decision, and I would like to take my time to get that decision right. And that's the approach that I would take in Tynwald. Thank you.
Mr. Crane?
Well, when I've met with most of you, you've said that you'll only make your mind up after the hustings. So this is a very unfair question to put on the spot. We're only halfway through. You've met many of these people one-to-one. I've only met them on Monday evening and again tonight. I could, like Bill, I could put forward a reason why I would think everybody here is a contender. You know, there's nobody that's ruled out. I wouldn't feel comfortable saying, yeah, I would put this person. I don't know them well enough, apart from Bill, but I'll leave him to one side because I don't know the rest. It would be unfair to pick him for that reason.
Good question, Tim. Thank you. I think it's difficult to make that assessment. You know, we've met last Monday. I know I crashed and burned on that. Hustings, I didn't do particularly well. However, I've put myself forward for my skills, and I think Mary Beth would be a really good contributor because of her business skills and coming over, etc. So I think I would actually vote for Mary Beth.
I'm definitely going to sit on the fence on this one, but not because I wouldn't want to work with any one of the 6 candidates here. Actually, similar to what Connor said, I spoke to my husband afterwards and said, they're all good, and they are all good. And each one of them have got very, very good strengths, and we're all very different. So I did only meet most of them on Monday night. I was exceptionally nervous, and therefore probably didn't soak up the knowledge as well. I think by the end of this session, I might be able to say 3 or 4, but I probably couldn't pick one other person. You've got a difficult decision. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, next question is Mr. Thomas, and given that the candidates on this occasion, like question time, have only 2 minutes to answer, I'm going to keep you to a 2-part question, no more than a 2-part question. Oh, wonderful.
Just building on something that Mr. Simmons said, what risks would there be in a politician being seen or actually collapsing a private sector organisation through political activity?
What risks would be seen in collapsing a private organisation through political activity? First on this one is Ms. Cole.
I apologise. I don't know if I really understood the question. Risks.
Mr. Simmons just said that he would have collapsed Manx Gas. That's what I understood. And I ask you, what risks are there for anybody, any politician, either being seen to or actually causing a political organisation, a private organisation, external organisation, to have issues or to collapse through a political tactic?
Happy with the question then?
Got it. Thank you. So I think that would be a very extreme measure for anyone to take, politician or not. That Manx Gas provides heating fuel for a majority of our economy. So from my point of view, I appreciate that he would want to put them completely under pressure, make sure that they had incredible scrutiny, that you knew what every number meant on every balance sheet, that you had access to all their documents, that you understood everything. But at the end of the day, it's not for a politician to bankrupt and make a company fold. At the end of the day, we need to work with all of our stakeholders, all of our members, to make sure that everyone has a chance to grow and to give opportunity to many people. That's a lot of jobs we're going to lose. So I don't, politically, I think that's a game that none of us really want to go down, and I think that's why a lot of you have made decisions you have with regard to Manx Gas, so you could avoid all of that.
Thank you. Mr. Keane.
Can I just clarify, sorry, was it from the position of a politician? The unpopular decision from the position of a politician?
Answer how you want. I mean, I've just raised the question. It was quite a strong
I
opinion. I respect Mr. Simmons having that view.
Yeah.
Mr. Simmons had the view. I've just asked you about the validity of that view.
I think ultimately, from a clinical perspective, if it's an unpopular decision with the public, the risk is that you guys ultimately, in every case, lose your seats. So you guys have stood on manifesto pledges to make those decisions based on the strength of argument for your constituents and the island as a whole. So I think that option should only be reserved in the event of a complete nuclear option, and only after every single other avenue has been explored should that even be up for consideration. As Mary Beth just highlighted, all the implications that come with that in terms of jobs, everything, that's quite as I say, a nuclear option to go down.
Thank you. Mr. Simmons.
Thank you very much. And yes, clearly it would be inappropriate for any politician to target a company to put it out of business. This is quite a different situation. Unless a company saying we need this or are we going to fold? And the question was, would you have said yes or no? My response is based on, actually, if you look at what's happened elsewhere, a number of energy companies have folded, and there has been a credible plan put in place to ensure that people continue to get gas. And what I would like to have seen is, what is the plan B? Because actually, there is still a real danger that Manx Gas will fold. And we're in a scenario whereby we're really passing on the hazard of running a commercial company onto the general public fellow man. And I actually think that's inappropriate. I'm pleased that now there's better regulation. It's something I supported many times and called for better regulation of our gas supplier. But I hope that clarifies my view. I do think there needs to be hazard for commercial operators, and it's unreasonable to expect that Tynwald and the Manx public will continue to just hike up the price just to help poorly run companies. And I believe this is a poorly run company. It should have hedged its exposure. It's not difficult. That's my view.
Thank you. Mr. Craig.
Clearly, it's a huge risk when you look at this. But there's also a risk on the other side that if you allow a company to continue operating in a way that's detrimental to the local economy and community, there's a problem there. So I see risks on both sides. You've asked when we think of the risk, well, the risks relate to jobs, they relate to immediate investment, they relate to continuity of essential services in the case we're talking about here. They relate to reputational risk and so on. So I can see all the difficulties of doing it. I think it's unfortunate, perhaps, that in the current climate in the UK, we're seeing gas companies, we're seeing supply companies going under on an almost weekly basis over these last few weeks. And I think that at the end of the day, the government has to have its due diligence. It has to act appropriately. It has to act with minimum damage being done. But nevertheless, the right decision has to be taken, and that's where you're weighing this up. It's a very difficult question to ask on a sort of 2 minutes notice, as it were. So, very tough. I want to think long and hard about it, but I can see the risks on both sides, and I think you've got to tread carefully in the main.
Thank you, Mrs. Bentham.
I'll move away from the gas issue. So it's more of a political interference or government interference issue, and I think you go back to the Nolan's 7 principles of governance as a public servant, as we all are, which is I've written this down, which is handy: selfishness, integrity, objectivity, accountability, openness, honesty, and leadership. And that's where your core principles are, and that's what you would look at to make a decision upon it.
Thank you, Mrs. Kelsey.
I was quite unequivocal about the 4. I can't underestimate how difficult that decision might have been for you all on the day. But as far as the gas situation was, I felt it was a recommendation from your regulatory authority, and because of that, they would have done an awful lot of the diligence. You did have a really good debate about it, and you did make a very unpopular decision. So in the case of this specific case, I do understand, or think I understand, why you made the decision. But you asked about risks. The risks are uncertainty. Nobody really feels very comfortable in an uncertain world. And if you had put off the decision, or had made a decision which did mean that Manx Gas would have to fold, then I think that the risks there were significantly more. And that should apply to any company. Maybe we could look at Steam Packet and others, but it applies to it. You've got to think about the uncertainty for the population of the Isle of Man, and that's the biggest risk in making those decisions. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Brown.
I think the language used was very emotive there, and that's possibly what's led to the question, in that the vote on the day was not whether to approve the increase or collapse the gas company. It was to vote for or against the increase. And voting against the increase would not necessarily have imminently collapsed the company, albeit, as we've heard, that it could still happen in the future. So I think that was emotive. However, you asked about the risks that are attached to that. You've got the short-term social risk of anything like that. You've got the impact on the population, the electorate, and that has to be the primary concern of the House when making a decision of that nature. But you have also then got the longer-term impacts that you need to consider. Are there plan Bs, plan Cs, plan Ds? What are the alternatives? And you also had a very real risk here as well, that with the regulator coming into play very shortly, would that decision have actually undermined the very thing that you'd simply implemented there? So there is no one single risk, but I don't believe that the vote was to collapse the company.
Thank you very much. Next question, Mr. Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With an ageing population, the challenges of social and residential care are increasing as the years go on. Just out of interest, these are difficult decisions as MHK, as politicians, we're going to have to face in the years ahead, how we do that, how we fund it. What would your views be on that? And do you see that as part and within the parcel of the current remit of the NHS? And again, as one part of the question, and how would you look to fund it?
So, should residential nursing care be part of the NHS? How would you fund it? First on this one, Mr. Keane.
Thank you. As I understand it from listening to debate, and I think it's been touched upon in the Ireland plan, that there is plans to integrate that anyway into a more of a health care and social package. The real crux is in the question is, like you say, how you fund it. Every single person, every single industry, every single avenue on the island is in need of money. You will never find anybody that would turn down the money. The key thing is going to have to be the prioritisation of where those funds go. So I think that needs to be looked at from something such as this, from an all-island perspective. This is bigger than a constituency. It's bigger than one individual MHK, bigger than one individual party. This is something which impacts upon every single person on the island. So I think it needs to be looked at that and priorities made from there against other national priorities. I'm thinking, obviously, in the industry I'm in, education is the big one that springs to mind. All of those key areas which touch every single man, woman and child on the island, there has to be a priority list of where that money is spent. Again, I'm thinking another big one is obviously infrastructure, which is quite prominent at the moment as well. It's going to take everybody to put aside, I think, individual differences and constituency differences from that perspective to prioritise where that needs to go. If the priority becomes that there might need to be some sort of increase from a taxation point of view, that's a separate question which needs to be answered, I think.
Thank you. Mr. Simmons.
Yeah, thank you. And this is a real challenge because 1 in 3 of us will require residential or nursing care. And it's expensive. We know it's expensive and it's difficult to provide here in Ireland. In terms of the question, is really how do you fund it? And if you look at Jersey, they've come up with a formula, which is quite an interesting formula, which shares the burden, if we want to use that word, in terms of funding. So there's a contribution from general revenue taxes, and then there's national insurance, and then there's also an element on the sale of the home. And I think that's where we need to end up, some form of multiple funding option. It's not a straightforward thing, particularly in a jurisdiction which has no death duties or inheritance tax, because that is an option, but that has other implications. So you think about these things very, very carefully. So I think probably we'll end up with something a bit long like Jersey. It's difficult for people to give up some of the value of their home. I understand it's a very emotive issue for families, but really I think to put it all on income tax, which was really, you have to question the intergenerational fairness of that in terms of for young people who generally perhaps are less financially secure position. So I think for me, I'm looking at some sort of hybrid model as the best option, which has probably a bit from the health service, national insurance, some form of general revenue, and also critically some form of actually from the estate of the home, if you like. I can't be more definite than that, but that's the general concept that I would go for.
Thank you. Mr. Crane.
I think the greatest frustration with this is that this has been coming for a long, long, long time. If you look at the population development and the growth in the elderly population, it's back in 2013 that the then Chief Minister said the biggest problem the Isle of Man faces is the ageing of the population. You know, we've done nothing in the 8 years since then to address that. We've now reached the point where 22% of the population are aged over 65, and now we're beginning to think about how we deal with it. You know, we've kind of left it far too late to do that, and it's going to be a problem to change that because the costs are there, will be high. Some of the current jurisdictions around us are looking at trying to reduce how much of the person's house gets utilised in providing for their residential nursing care. And we've got those issues around us. So how do we fund this? And it's going to be difficult. I think it has to be a mixed approach. You know, hybrid, I think was the term that Bill used for it. It has to be a mixture of these things, but it has to be an area of gradual change, and we have to look into the longer term. We're up into, in terms of the percentage of the population over 65, we're in the 6 oldest countries on the planet. You know, that's how extreme we've become as we've gone through this. We do need to look at what's happening in the future, because at the moment, with our births going down and the percentage of the population over 65 going up, the problem's only going to grow. So we need to address it, but we need a much wider range of policies about population in order to take it forward for the future.
Thank you. Mrs. Bentham.
I think it's an economic risk, isn't it? That's the question that you're talking about. And I think our biggest challenge coming up is actually the ageing population. But rather than concentrate on the ageing population, I think we need to encourage people to move to the island. I think we certainly need to encourage young people to come back to the island. I think we need to get the kids off the treadmill of schools, A-levels, degrees. I think we should encourage a variation and support them in offering different skills so that we can employ them and they contribute back into the economy, and that's how we'll pay for it.
Well, I think it is already integrated, if you can call it integrated, but obviously a lot of very good private sectors and maybe potentially not so good private sector supporters of residential and nursing care. I have to acknowledge my aunt died recently in Beaconsfield up in Ramsey. She had had excellent care. It's a private organisation. However, coming from her commissioner's house, she was fully funded. I couldn't have wanted for anything better for her. I think, for me, the integration of everything we do, such that if you're ill, you will be supported. If you can afford to pay for some of that yourself, you should pay for some of that yourself. And it doesn't really matter whether it be just choosing to have a hip replacement or being in need of residential care, especially being older. But how should we fund it is more difficult, because the answer is we can't afford not to fund it. Individuals who can afford, perhaps because I have a nice house and I've almost paid my mortgage, or my husband and I have almost paid our mortgage, I think we could look at not so much a death duties, but a way to say, okay, does someone have some residual value when and if they die that could be used to support things that the state has looked after them previously. So I think there's probably, is it a hybrid model? Of course it is. I think everything we do will be hybrid, but I think there's ways to look at clever ways to not necessarily impact the person's life, but perhaps look at their estate at a later date. And that's about it after 2 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Byrne.
I've also had personal experience of this recently, in that my mother-in-law spent the final few years of her life in a care home, albeit on the Big Island, not here. But I was incredibly grateful that, having spent her entire life in a council house, that safety net was there for her, albeit that we could also financially support her. I think your question was twofold. Should it be part of the National Health Service, and how is that funded? I don't believe that putting the burden of something like this onto our already stretched health service would be the right thing to do. It needs to be seen as separate from that. But if that's the case, how are we going to fund it? And it's, as some of the other candidates have said here, it's got to be that hybrid approach. Yes, there has to be an absolute safety net there to make sure that nobody is left homeless in their later years, but there also has to be support from maybe third sector, private individuals. And I think we also need to get away from this mindset at the moment of these terrible TV adverts of putting a burden on people to think that it's their obligation to provide an inheritance for their children. Providing care is no different to providing a pension or that rainy day fund for health. We need to have that mindset that if we can afford to pay for it ourselves, we should do. But maybe we need regulation to make sure that it's not then raped and pillaged, that the funding is used appropriately. So it is a hybrid answer, but I don't believe it would form part of the health service.
Thank you. Ms. Cole.
This is a really good question. And once again, I have personal experience, but it's from the US. And our system, as many of you know, is really, for lack of better words, messed up. And so the way that it happens there is, if you are below a certain threshold, you can get care from the state, but otherwise you're required to sell all of your assets. And then all that money goes into the state, and then the state will fund you. Problem is, there's not enough state beds. So this is a diverse answer to get to the funding part, to get to how do we, there's two competing interests here. Preservation of intergenerational wealth competing against present quality of life. So how do we kind of try to find the compromise between those two big interests? And the answer is like Corelli said, we need to get more people over here to help with the tax base. We need to help people figure out how to invest into the future that might not be that great. It's the 80-20 rule. You spend 80% of your healthcare costs in the last 20% of your life. It's that whole if you know that going into it, we all should know and be our eyes open that this is going to be a later in life cost. But we all have to figure out how do we make policies, legislation to encourage more people to come here to be part of the pot. So we don't have this 22% over 65 issue. We just need to encourage people here to be part of our economy and to help it grow and to create private investment opportunities for people to also help share with the NHS burden of trying to take care of so many of our older people in our population.
Thank you. Next question is in the hands of Mrs. Maltby.
If successful on Tuesday, will this be your primary employment?
If successful on Tuesday, will this be your primary employment? Mr. Simmons.
Yes. I'll be able to completely focus on this role. I've no other employment positions, and I'll also give it my full attention from day one. Thank you.
Mr. Craig?
Yes, I will continue with a very, very small second role. I'm a reviser on one of the GCSEs for one of the big English boards. It takes about 7 or 8 days a year, total spread over the year. I'll continue with that, but this will be my main employment, absolutely.
Thank you. Mrs. Bentham?
Hot topic in the House of Commons at the minute. I'm actually the director of a new startup company called Builderskill, which provides upskilling and training for construction people on the island, not competing with college, supporting college. And I'm passionate about that role, and I want that business to be successful. We need it for the island, we need it for the economy, we certainly need to upskill construction. However, I've got a partner. We've created the perfect part-time position for both of us. I can't work part-time, it's driving me absolutely crazy. She will up her responsibilities and I will take an overseeing role. However, if that does impact on my position as an MLC, if I was successful, I would step down, so I would evaluate it, but I think it's important for it to continue.
Sorry, step down as an MLC or step down as a director?
MLC.
As an MLC.
Oh no, sorry, as a director.
As a director.
Sorry, I keep being an MLC.
Sorry, yeah. That's what I wanted to know.
Yeah.
Mrs. Kelsey.
No, this would be my full-time job. I would give up my total recess of the service career, and this would be my only work.
Mr. Brown?
Simple question deserves a simple answer. Yes.
Ms. Cole.
I would give up my daytime job that I have working in the legal and contracts team for the yacht management company, but I would maintain my directorship within Forage and Vintners. At the moment, since I have a daytime job, my role is basically more so doing strategic decisions and luckily a little bit of product development with my husband, but he basically controls all the operations and management of the business. So this would be the focus, and my commitment would be to this role.
Can we help you?
It's my question.
Mr. Keane.
Yes, it would. It would represent a career change for me. I hope that by applying and doing that shows for such a short potential term shows my seriousness and dedication to the role. Obviously, as an active teacher at the moment, I would have to serve a small notice period. I do currently have commitments to some students. I'm thinking particularly to exam classes, GCSEs, etc. There would have to be some sort of managed exit. But my employer's been really good so far as part of the process. I would hope that they would continue to do so, and that, as I say, we could perhaps come to some sort of managed exit. But the simple answer is yes.
Thank you very much. Next question, Mrs. Christian.
Thank you. If a member of Legislative Council announced they were going to run for a general election, i.e. become an MHK, do you think that MLC should remain or resign in their post?
So should MLCs have to resign in order to contest a seat for the House of Keys? First on that, Mr. Craig.
I hope I've heard that correctly. I've got one hearing aid that stopped working in the middle of this morning. So if an MHK, no, if an MLC, just run through that again.
So the question was, should an MLC have to give up their seat in order to contest for a seat in the House of Keys?
Okay, I understand what you're saying. And I understand that that's the issue we've been through recently in practice. I think it's such a new feature, really, for members of the Legislative Council to then stand for Tynwald. And I know I've heard different views on how that worked in practice, sort of thing. I've heard different views on, routes into the Keys. I think it's been a refreshing sort of change to happen. I think it's been interesting to see it. It's been interesting for people who've developed their skills as MLCs to go forward. Should they've resigned the position? I'm open-minded on it. On balance, perhaps not. I think that it has worked, and going forward, okay, it's left with the difficulty of a by-election for the Legislative Council, but it has brought two people into the Keys who clearly had developed experience and skills within the Legislative Council, within Tynwald. I think it's on balance, it's worked. I can understand some of the questions about it.
Thank you. Mrs. Bentham.
No, I don't think they should resign from their position. I think it would give continuity with the MLCs if they're still in place. They're knowledgeable, etc. If they are successful, they move to House of Keys, and the results are something like what's been happening here. So no, I don't think they should stand down.
Mrs. Kelsey.
Not before the election, without doubt. I think the very fact that the public were very keen to support the recent two shows that they didn't feel that there was any conflict there, and therefore I think the not before the election. However, if they then get a resounding quack, oops, from the public when they stand for election as a Keys, then there's got to be a question of their credibility as members of LegCo. So I think the resignation question for me would be after the general election if they weren't successful. Thank you.
Mr. Brown.
Well, I think we have to view it against the context of the Lisbane report, where his chief concerns seemed to be movement in the opposite direction and ensuring that LegCo wasn't seen as a retirement home for MHKs. So I completely understand in that direction. But it's important that we get the absolute best people serving as MHKs. And as we've seen today, we've got a number of candidates standing for LegCo who are in current jobs, but who've given their assurances that they would step down if successful. And I see no reason why it shouldn't be the same for somebody on LegCo standing as an MHK, because we want the best people in there. There's a very good experience that they will have gained as an MLC that they could apply in the House of Keys. So I don't believe that it would be a burden on them to resign beforehand, simply if they were successful.
Thank you. Ms. Cole.
I tend to agree with Craig on this. If opportunity's there and you feel like you are the best person for the job at the time, and you only have 5-year opportunities to seize it, I don't see why you should have to step down to give it a shot, to go. The world loves a trier. So I think a lot of this is, the concern is that whether or not you have a conflict between your two roles, or that you're trying to come into LegCo to become an MHK. I'm not sure if that's a lot, like you're saying, it's more of the inflow of MHKs to becoming MLCs than the outflows of MLCs into MHKs. I think people who are working in the MLC role are working in it specifically because of the different nature of the skill set that is required. And that is probably why I don't think it's going to be a rule that MLCs are all going to go out for MHKs. I think it's more of an exception.
Thank you, Mr. Keenan.
For me, no. I think that they're two very distinct roles. Obviously, MHKs are policy drivers, MLCs are scrutineers from a legislative perspective. I'm not sure, can I mention members' names, Mr. Speaker? I think Ms. Lord Brennan actually answered this question fantastically in a Keys husting, where she said we wouldn't expect other people to give up their role. So why would we expect that of an MLC? As I say, you wouldn't expect someone to give up necessarily their day job in order to do it. If, again, to reference another member, I know Mr Glover had the strength and courage of his conviction to give up his job, and I'm sure that was quite possibly looked upon favourably by his constituents. But I believe that was his individual decision. I don't think that should be placed upon anybody to necessarily do that. But as I say, to answer the fundamental question, I don't think they should have to. I don't see them not getting in as an MHK as a rejection of their skills that they would have and have gained as a member of council.
And Mr Simmons. No, I don't think so. Other public servants aren't expected to resign their positions to stand for keys, so I don't think it would be fair to implement that for MLCs. And actually I think it's helpful. I think it's helpful to have some MLCs who've moved to MHKs, and I think it's also helpful to have some MHKs moving to legislative council. I think experience I think experience matters, actually. I think that's quite important. So, but thank you.
Mr Hooper.
So I've heard a lot of answers where people have kind of, I don't have all the information, I need to sit on both sides of the fence, and actually you can't do that in Tynwald. You have to push the red or green button, and you will almost never have all the information in front of you. Hopefully you'll have seen the island plan that's been published already in draft form. So what are your views on the island plan, and would you support it in its current form? And that is a yes or no question. There will be no more information provided.
So would you support the Isle of Man plan in its current form? Yes or no answers preferred. First up on this one is Mrs Bentham.
Well, the objectives are secure, vibrant and sustainable, aren't they, of the island plan? I don't think anyone can refute that. I think you've all got together, and it's really heartening to see that it's hopefully a cohesive document that you've all contributed to. I think that's massively important. It's unfair to say yes or no there, Laurie, to be fair, because there are going to be more contributions to the island plan coming forward from government departments, etc. But yes or no, yes, I would support the island plan.
Mrs Kelsey.
Simple answer is yes. Slightly longer answer is, should I not be elected as an MLC, I will be making comments on the island plan.
Thank you. Mr Brown?
I think that's the easiest question of the afternoon to answer yes or no. Absolutely, I support the island plan. It's a vital document. There is nothing objectionable in there. The aims are commendable. Most importantly, though, it is a draft island plan, and it will evolve, and I'm confident that it will also evolve beyond January. Because, as was said in the House on Tuesday, no plan survives first contact with the enemy. So you have to support it at the moment and continue to support it as it evolves in the future.
Thank you. Ms Cole.
I think I would change it from draft island plan to draft island outline. I think it's a great outline, and it's an outline that everyone can get behind. There's really good points, mission statements, but it does lack the detail. But if the question is, do I agree with the outline? Do I agree with the points that they're trying to achieve? Absolutely. We need a lot of this. And then I guess the big question is, are we going to have the bandwidth to get it to move forward, to get all of this achieved? That's going to be the real challenge.
Thank you. Mr Keane.
Yes, I would. I think fundamentally as an outline document, it's a big improvement on the previous programme for government. I do like it's a visionary document, as has been mentioned a moment. It's still in the draft stage. It's been touched upon, I think, as well. There is an evolutionary document, and I do like the concept of that. It is open to change. It's fluid. It can move as and with the global and society changes that are needed to it. I think it's a really powerful document in terms of recognising community partnerships as well. I know this is something that was touched upon in the debate the other day, but I think for government to recognise that they don't necessarily have all the answers to all of the problems is a really, really strong characteristic, and I think that the fact that's been highlighted has been really, really good. As I say, I would support it in its current guise, but I have noticed what I think is a slight omission. I know that agriculture has had lots of reference to it, but I noticed that fisheries wasn't mentioned in the document at all. So would be interesting to see if something is mentioned in the actual final document.
Thank you. Mr Simmons.
Yes, I fully support the plan. It's a great start, but clearly it's just a plan. And just having a plan is helpful, but it doesn't actually move you forward in terms of people seeing a difference on the ground. So I'd be delighted to work as part of project teams, taking a section of that plan and turning it into more specific initiatives and actions, and in the next 15 months, hopefully, work on some of those projects to get it off to a good start. Because I think only when people see action, as people see things changing on the ground, will actually confidence in government improve. So I think a plan is great, but actually it's implementation that is really critical.
Mr. Craig.
Yeah, I sat in Tynwald the other day on Tuesday, and if I'd been voting, I'd have voted for the plan. I think the plan is a good start, but it is just a start. There was debate about whether this was an overall vision, an outline, and so on. I think it's crucial going forward to finish with a complete plan being presented to the January 22. Tynwald is a big ask, really, because it's all to be done. The questions I mentioned before, there were questions about key performance indicators, the baseline measurements, the metrics of it, and so on, to try and move towards evidence-based government. So there's terrific work to be done. I'm keen to see those issues moving to outcomes and progressing then to evidence-based 5-part business cases and so on. We've got all of that to go through. And to get that in place in meaningful time so that this administration can get on and deliver some of the metrics on it, that's the hard part, the implementation of it. So in a sense, yeah, I'm absolutely with it at this stage. But gosh, there's a way to go here and a lot of work to be done.
Thank you very much. And we'll take one more question and then move to closing statements, if that's okay. And the last question, Mr. Wannenberg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Do you think the minimum wage is too low? And do you think 0-hour contracts are fair?
Right, so is there 2 minutes, everybody? Is the minimum wage too low or 0 hours?
I'll take a yes or a no on the first one.
Or 0 hour contracts. To start this one, I'll call Mrs. Cassie.
Minimum wage is too low. I think we should be looking at a living wage, and a living wage that's appropriate for people in the Isle of Man, not necessarily tagging it to London or anywhere else. I think we have to understand the cost of living on this island, and in some cases they are definitely higher, and in probably 1 or 2 areas it's probably lower. Certainly, petrol, you might pay a lot of duty, but you don't need as much of it. So just making sure that we don't make assumptions based on something from across, because that would be wrong. But it is low, too low. So I would say we should be looking at a serious island living wage. And everyone should be on it. On the far as 0 hours contracts, though, I have to make an admission that within government we do have some people that help us up at Government House who are on 0 hours contracts. And that's because we don't do a lot of functions, but when we do, we need to get support from around the economy. Nearly all, or I would say all of those people, are actually either in full-time employment or they're retired. So therefore they come and help us a little bit. Should we not allow those people to come and work with us when they want to come and help us out for 6 hours a year? And we don't know when those 6 hours are? No. If people are keen to come and work with us, we should have them working with us. So therefore, from a basic perspective, I think 0 hours contracts do have their place. However, there needs to be protections in place to ensure that people aren't being exploited. And my son, being one of these, admittedly he's 18 now, but being told at the last minute he's not needed when he wanted to go to work and actually was ready to go to work, and he thought he was going to have a bit of money in his pocket at the end of the day. That's unfair. So I think if you let somebody down at short notice, you should still pay them what they would have got for their shift.
Thank you. Mr. Brown.
Very much the same. Is the minimum wage too low? Absolutely. It has to be a living standard wage. Are 0 hour contracts fair? No, I don't believe they are, but are they necessary? Then yes. As outlined, they are needed in certain industries. They are needed by certain individuals. It's not all a one-way street, and certain individuals need 0 hour contracts in order to fit in with their lifestyles. What I would prefer to see, though, is a greater regulation around that, putting certain burdens on the employer, as was identified there, making sure that there is an obligation to honour those contracts, and making it that it doesn't prevent somebody from earning a living wage elsewhere. So as a supplementary contract, zero-hour contracts are absolutely necessary.
Thank you. Ms. Cole.
So I, as an employer, we don't pay people minimum wage, but we can't quite get to the living wage yet. And we do have zero-hour contracts. And I know that as most employers, we all want to pay people what they're due. And the problem is that there's a lot of taxes, rates, burdens, and costs that you can't make it work. If it's a rainy day and you only take 20% of what your anticipated revenue that you thought you're going to get, there's nowhere to recover those costs because certain things are fixed. So in terms of minimum wage, yeah, I definitely want to see it go up. I want people to be able to have a little bit of extra money in their pocket so that they're able to actually engage back in our economy. As for zero-hour contracts, I understand the downside of them, but I also understand some people's lives are complicated. They can only hit 2 or 3 hours here, do 6 hours then, maybe every now and then give you a full day. And you try to work with people as much as they can because you understand everyone needs a little bit of flexibility. But so I think for the island, in terms of the way that things operate, and we have a boom-bust kind of seasonal economy, that we kind of need these types of terms to be available to employers to be able to use them.
Thank you. Mr. Keane.
Thank you. I think Mary Beth just touched upon there. Any discussion in and around minimum wage, there's got to be the effect that will have on medium and small businesses as well. But I think personally for me that my frame of reference is to use kind of poverty indicators and looking at things such as affordable housing, food, heating. And to answer that, it is yes, it does. We do need an increase in minimum wage. The 0 hours contracts aspect of the question, I look at it through a slightly different prism with the career I'm in. So as a teacher, supply teachers and supply support staff are on 0 hours contracts. That works for them though. That works for the employer and it works for the employer and the employee. For example, the school can phone them up, say, can you come in? If the employee can't make it, they can say no. That's not held against them or anything like that. So I look at it through a slightly different prism. I think the wording of 0 hour contracts is what gives the problem because of the negative connotation that comes with it.
Mr. Simmons.
I think the minimum wage is too low. When I talk to people in businesses across the Isle of Man, the biggest challenge they face is actually staffing, attracting talent to come and work and retaining them. And as I've said in Keys in past years, I don't really understand why someone working in a hotel in Blackpool should be getting paid more than someone working in a hotel in Douglas, given that the costs of living in Douglas are clearly higher than in Blackpool. So I think the minimum wage does need to go up. I think that will increase costs. So I don't think we should be naive about this. I think that will help drive inflation. Inflation is increasingly going to become an issue for this administration because it's going to have all sorts of consequences. So I think putting the minimum wage up will just drive up inflation as well. But I think it's the right thing to do for a variety of reasons. In terms of 0 hours contracts, I understand they have some negative connotations, but I think they have their place. They provide a choice for people. And for some people, potentially also who've got other responsibilities, so family health caring responsibility, particularly for people whose family are not on the island, a 0 hours contract is actually really important because they cannot commit to a permanent contract. So I think there are pros and cons and everything, and broadly, I think a 0 hours contract does have its place as long as it's used responsibly. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Craig.
Yes, when you compare a minimum wage with a living wage, if you have a minimum wage that doesn't reach the living wage, then presumably the person is having to get benefits, and there is a sense of this exploitation there, that the wage they're being paid is not adequate to live on. I think those two have to be aligned. You know, I think they have to be brought together. So yes, the minimum wage is too low. We need to move forward on that. The 0 hours contract, I think, is a lot more complicated because many of the people on 0 hours contracts have to actually have some other income sources, and that may well be true for many supply teachers. Not all, but for some supply teachers, that would be true, that they've got other income sources and they're quite happy to as Connor outlined, they're quite happy to work on that basis. You know, it suits them. It's kind of casual work from time to time. They'll be asked to go in and do some work covering for an absent former colleague maybe and things like that. So it works for them. But where you do have to be careful as having safeguards against exploitation of people who are being forced to work their sole income on 0 hours contracts, and they don't know if they're working next week or not. And it really creates difficulties for them, and they're living with a degree of poverty. And I think that's a risk about it. And it's putting those safeguards in place.
Thank you very much. And Mrs. Bentham.
Yeah, I think the minimum wage is too low. We need to move towards a living wage, and I think the price of products in the basket hasn't been reviewed for quite a while. That was in a report recently, so we need to look at that. In terms of 0 hours contracts, I know it would definitely affect catering, and it's certainly affecting construction now. Brickies are moving for 50p an hour more, and it's causing inflationary pressure. They're not protected though with regard to holiday pay, sickness, and they should be. And I think it goes back to I think Diane mentioned it and you mentioned it about unscrupulous employers. They need protection. There is a need and a value to a 0 hours contract, but we need to carefully manage and protect unscrupulous employers really.
Thank you very much. We'll now move to closing statements by the candidates. We have 3 minutes to sum up, as it were, and we will start with Mr. Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you again for your time today. I hope you found the answers given by my fellow candidates and me helpful, maybe even challenging, and I certainly hope you disagreed with some of the answers, because at the end of the day, that's the thing that will promote healthy debate.
I'd be very surprised if you don't have a good idea now as to who you're likely to be voting for on Tuesday. Certainly you have more information than you did 2 hours ago, Tim, when you asked us that very same question. But please just allow me a further minute to just summarise why I believe I have the skills that will be needed to succeed as an MLC. I'm collegiate in my approach. I seek consensus. But I know that this isn't a utopian world that we're living in. I know that there will be disagreement. In fact, as I said earlier, we need disagreement to promote healthy debate. I'm respectful of others and their opinions, but I will challenge when necessary. In fact, as a northerner married to a southern girl, I'm frequently told that I'm very open with my opinion. However, as an engineer, my opinions are based on evidence and fact, and I'm very happy to be challenged on them, to listen, and to change them when evidence dictates. But when I challenge other opinions, I try to be respectful of those other opinions, not belittling or downplaying them, but instead listening and moving towards consensus, because I recognise that any debate is successful when there's a meeting of the minds. I'm supportive of others, and I'm much more interested in outcomes than I am in who gets the respect for what's achieved or the credit for what's achieved there. As a business leader, I strongly believe that there is absolutely no room for ego in teams. We succeed or we fail together, and that's an ethos that I would apply. And I believe that we all have a stewardship role to play. And personally, I hope when looking back in 15 months, 6 years, 11 years, whatever it may be, that I can say that I played my part in making the island a better place to live. So although this appointment is for a 15-month term, it is very much a part of our long-term strategy. It's about doing many things, such as delivering the island plan, and that goes a long time into the future. So all I would ask on Tuesday when you're casting your votes is that you look not just at the next 15 months for this appointment, but for the long-term future, and select the candidates that you believe are best positioned to deliver the skills needed to be a successful MLC. Thank you again for your time.
Thank you very much. Ms. Cole.
Mr. Speaker and honourable members, thank you again, once again, for taking time to learn more about myself and how I'll be able to serve the House of Keys in the Isle of Man as a member of Legislative Council. I'd like to take the opportunity to thank as well as Dr. Haywood, Mr. Hooper, Mrs. Barber, and Mr. Wanneberg for giving me an opportunity to make it to the table. I'd also like to thank all members who I've had the pleasure to meet and to give me have discussions with them surrounding their views on how the role of MLC can be improved and work better. From my discussions with various members, I have been able to distill your expectations of the role of MLC into 3 general areas: rigorous review of legislation, engagement and scrutiny, and provide constructive feedback on potential or unintended consequences. I have a high level of experience in dealing with the review of legislation, drafting and revising framework agreements and complex legal instruments for both technical and content issues, working with stakeholders relating to government-owned utilities, working with regulators relating to access for development of resources and ensuring preservation of wildlife. My capabilities and legal understanding will be readily available for your counsel. With the past MHK election just recently passed, I respect that you have all just completed the great listening exercise, where you have gone to the doorsteps of all the citizens and you've heard their issues, concerns, and expectations for the future. I'm sure me just saying this is triggering some specific conversations you've had. I see the exercise of the election process as the great link between the citizens of our nation and the institutions which govern. As a member of Legislative Council, I would like to provide my support to you as the elected members of the House of Keys to help shape our island's future. I want to provide you confidence that I'm highly qualified, both with legal training and practice, as well as being highly pragmatic and practical, understanding of how the local economy, education, health, and the environment work for us. In the recent elections of the MLC, you and your predecessors engaged on transformational journey of the role of MLC by selecting candidates who could provide you support of both counsel and critic. Their value and input and their energy has demonstrated that the days of the role of MLC being viewed as a philanthropic gesture or as a pre-retirement position are over. A new bar is set, and it's mighty high. I'll take energy, enthusiasm, and loads of understanding of how the law intersects with our citizenry. I'm qualified, I have a proven track record, and highly committed and invested in this island. And most importantly, I'm ready, willing, and able to help. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Mr. Keane.
Honourable, let me start again. It's been a long afternoon. Honourable members, I would like to reiterate my thanks to all of you who have made it possible for me to engage in this process, and thank you all for your time this afternoon. The opportunity to come to legislative buildings and have both frank as well as some more light-hearted political discussions with the island's policymakers has been a fantastic experience, especially at the start of a new house when you were all finding your feet in your new roles. I would like to especially thank, I know he's gone out of the room now, but Mr. Collister for his tour of the chambers a few weeks ago, and should a Tynwald Tours committee ever need to be formed, he would represent an excellent chair. I would also like to thank my family. They have offered me great support over the last few weeks of this process, allowing me time to meet with members, take phone calls and visit Tynwald. Combining this election process with my work commitments has been a challenge, and I'd really like to emphasise my gratitude for their support. I would also like to thank my employer and colleagues for the support they have offered. I hope it provides you confidence that if elected, I will offer a unique and beneficial perspective to Tynwald. I understand this role, the scrutiny aspect, the requirements as a Tynwald member, potential of a committee member, potential at PAC. I believe I have the skills. I'm a collaborative and open thinker. I think I have the personality and knowledge to complement the existing membership of both Council and Tynwald and offer a broadness of perspective across both chambers. It is possible that we could have two pieces of generational legislation coming up for approval within the lifetime of this Keys administration. The education and climate change bills could have far-reaching implications for the future of the island. I believe I can add value to the discussions around these two key topic areas which would affect us all. It would be a privilege to have contributed if and when these bills reach the point of royal assent. Finally, I would like to extend my offer to meet with members before the vote, should they wish, and hope that we may have the opportunity to work together to help deliver positive outcomes for our island. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Simmons.
Yeah, thanks very much. Thanks so much everyone for coming, and for you guys for hanging on till the bitter end. My experience will make a significant contribution from day one, and this is a 15-month appointment, and there's a lot of important stuff coming up in the next 3 months. I'm fully committed to the role. I know how Tynwald works, all the peculiarities. I also know how government works and how it doesn't work at times. I will help bring a focus on effective implementation, which is essential for any plan to work. I will get my sleeves rolled up and I'll get stuck in immediately. So if I'm elected, I will make a meaningful, positive difference across the various aspects of the MLC role. And that's why I'm asking you to vote for me on Tuesday. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Mr. Crane.
Thank you. I'll try to beat the 3-minute bell on this one. Thank you for your time this afternoon. Thank you for the questions you've asked. Much appreciated and provoked a lot of thought. And at the end of sessions like this, sometimes you go away and think I missed an opportunity or two to add things in. But thank you for that. And we've enjoyed the day, or I certainly have anyway. In my earlier introduction, I outlined 3 themes. I know the Isle of Man, I understand evidence, and I do scrutiny. And they're 3 key areas I think you as a group of members are keen to have. In the minute or 2 remaining, I want to very briefly explore the role of the MLCs and requirement for that role and my own suitability. And there's a job description for MLCs. It dates from December 2017. It was formulated by Tynwald at that time. Many of you were part of that. Just picking out some of the bits from it, it talks about MLCs providing a distinct and influential voice. And I think I could do that. I think I come from a different perspective. I'm not from a financial, commercial perspective. I'm very much from a local island-based perspective. It actually says that voice should be based on an understanding and experience of island life. I believe that I absolutely provide that. It talks about scrutiny. We've covered that. It talks about the members of the Legislative Council being an important resource for the members of the House of Keys, and that's an interesting term, an important resource. I invite you to consider these points as you reflect on my CV again and base your judgments on that. Reread my experience and my involvement in this community, education, Island Games, Methodist Church, local commissioner, climate reality leader, scouting. I didn't have room to say I've served on the Peel and Western Housing Committee, Western Civic Community Site, the Municipal Association, Richmond Hill Consultative Association. I've done all of those backgrounds. Read between the lines too. Read when it says I work with honesty, integrity, inclusivity, concern for the environment, to care for people who are struggling. I know many of you would share those sentiments. I've always called the Isle of Man home, and wherever I end up in life, it will always be home. I'm passionate about most things Manx, and whether inside or outside the Legislative Council, I will continue to work serving the best interests of the Isle of Man. I believe I could be a strong resource for the popularly elected members of the Keys, and I ask for one of your votes in the election on Tuesday. Thank you. Guramayaad.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Bentham.
Mr. Speaker, honourable members, I echo everyone else's thanks to you all for staying the distance. Mine is very brief, my summary. I hope you've got to know a little bit about me and that I have shown I'm an honest, straight-talking person with fewer words. I am home with facts, figures and detail, and if you've noticed, I've got oodles of paper. I don't wing it. I like to know what I'm talking about. I think I am objective and fair. This has served me well in carrying out my role. Scrutineering, we'll go back to it because that is what the job is a warts and all approach and needs a person that creates an environment of open and honest discussion. I am a people person and I have consistently demonstrated throughout my career success in forming collaborative teams. My non-conflict, empathetic approach avoids delays to outcomes, which is what you all want. In order for you to carry out your roles effectively, you need a council around you that is supportive and that has that time for the attention of detail. I use the word counsel, this is in the job title, and is fundamental to the role to provide you counsel. I've never classed myself as political, but I care about what goes on around me, and therefore I've learned through this recruitment process that I am political. For me, I like to do the right thing. I like to fix things that are broken, and I love to work. That's what makes me sleep soundly at night. I've got the energy, time and experience to excel in this role. If I promise you one thing, I will earn my keep. Thank you.
Mrs. Kelsey.
Well, can I also thank you for coming and staying?
I'm curious. I'm a very curious person. I was a curious person at school. I'm a curious person from my Air Force career, and I'm definitely a curious person in my current role. That curiosity also then leads into diligence and hard work, because you can't just be asking all the questions. You've also got to be prepared to listen to the answers and come up with something from that, form something from that. So what I think I'm offering to MHKs and to colleagues that I work with on the LegCo is that I will work hard, I will ask the questions if they need to be asked, and I will support legislation going through all the way through to royal assent, but also if we need to look at policies or plans where I can add some value. And that is important, that I need to add some value, not just hold things up. If I flip on the other side is I can start on Tuesday. I'm very, very keen to make a difference very quickly, and at the very least add an extra 2 sets of hands to the mammoth task that you've set yourselves for with the island plan and other things you have got in the pipeline. And that's why I would like you to consider voting for me on Tuesday. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Well, honourable members, thank you for coming and putting your questions to the candidates to the election, which will be obviously the first thing on Tuesday morning. Would you mind joining me in thanking the candidates for coming along and answering the questions? Thank you very much.